Would you go to school during the trip? It all depended on how many children there were in the wagon train. If there were many, in some wagon trains, they would get together when the wagon stopped for lunch or dinner, and an older person would go over lessons with the children. On some wagon trains, children would study their readers and learn arithmetic from their parents or older brothers and sisters. Many families were able to bring a few books with them in their wagons so that you could practice your reading. Some people said that the whole trip was one great big school because you were learning new things every day. You might learn the names of flowers or animals you had never seen before. You would learn about fixing things when they broke down because you couldn't just go to a store and buy something new. You would learn about cooking outdoors and tying up the animals so that they had enough room to move around and eat but couldn't run away. There were so many new things to learn that by the end of the trip, you knew a lot more than when you had started out. What chores would you have to do? Everybody worked very hard during the long days of traveling west. Children had lots of things to do. They milked the cows and fetched water from the rivers and watched the cattle when they walked behind the wagons and helped cook the food and washed the dishes and helped skin and prepare the buffalo or deer or wild turkey when they were caught, and collected wood or buffalo chips in baskets to help make the fire, and shook out the blankets and quilts in the fresh air, and hung the beef jerky to dry. Some of it was hard work, some easy. But most of the chores were interesting because instead of living in a house, you were living in a covered wagon and things had to be done in new and different ways. Could you have fun on the trip? If you like going places that you have never been before, and if you like seeing things for the first time that you have only heard or read about, you would have had a lot of fun. For there was something new to see and hear almost every day. During the day, there would be a chance to explore a little if you didn't go too far from the wagons. Then, at night, after you helped with dinner and cleaned up the dishes, many interesting things happened. Usually, there was someone in the wagon train who knew how to play a harmonica or a fiddle. Everybody would gather around and sing songs and dance. Sometimes you would sit by the campfire and listen to stories, maybe even a ghost story. And if the sun was shining in early July, the July 4th celebrations were something very special. Everybody prepared for days for an Independence Day party. Most people didn't carry an American flag with them on the trip, and so they had to make one. You would see something red and something white and something blue, so you would look for just the right material. First, you would take a sheet for the white of the flag. In one wagon train, they cut up a red shirt to make the stripes and a blue jacket for the stars to be sewn on. By the end of 1845, you would have needed 28 stars. If you knew how to sew, you could help to make the flag, and before you knew it, Old Glory would be ready. Then came the big feast: buffalo and antelope meat, sage hens, a little bit like chicken, and jackrabbits, and of course potatoes and beans and rice, and a special treat of pickles if someone had brought them on the trip. For dessert, there were different kinds of cakes and chocolate. Everybody ate so much they thought they would never eat again. It was a day you would remember for a long, long time. Would you see any wild animals? Absolutely. The biggest animal that you would see would be a buffalo. If a herd came near the wagon train, you might see hundreds and hundreds at one time. They would run close together and kick up a lot of dust. You could feel the earth shaking as they went by. One young woman named Helen Carpenter traveled west in a covered wagon and wrote down what she saw. She wrote that when an old buffalo was shot and fell on its side, it was so big that you couldn't see the head of a 9-year-old boy standing behind it. You would also see prairie dogs. They were very interesting to watch because they lived in prairie dog cities. At least that's what it looked like. Lots of doorway holes and mounds all over the ground. When you came near a prairie dog city, you knew it right away. The prairie dogs would sit outside their doorways on their hind legs and watch you. If you came too close, they would run inside. It seemed as if they were curious about who you were, but didn't really want to meet strangers. Wherever there were prairie dogs, there were rattlesnakes and owls. They seemed to be next-door neighbors, but were not always friendly. Sometimes a rattlesnake or owl would catch a prairie dog and eat it. You would also see or hear other wild animals. At night, if you heard a chorus of howls, it could be wolves or coyotes. And in the daytime, you might see jackrabbits, wild turkeys, sage hens, and lizards. You would probably see an antelope running, but if you didn't look quickly, it might be gone. That's because they are very fast runners. If you think of mosquitoes as wild animals, then you would see and feel a lot of them. Could you send a letter or receive one? Back in the 1840s, there were no post offices west of the Mississippi River, so it wasn't easy to send or receive a letter. But there were a few ways that you could do it. Sometimes people would send letters to you at a fort on the trail. Some supply wagons going west would carry the letter to the fort and leave it there for you to pick up. At the forts, you might be able to leave a letter, which another wagon train would carry back home for you. In some places, you were charged money to send a letter, and in some places, you were charged money to receive one. Today, of course, only the sender of the letter pays money for the stamps. There were no envelopes for letters in those days. You would fold the letter up and drip some melted wax on the edge. When the wax cooled and hardened, the letter could not be opened until you broke the wax. That way, you would know that nobody had read your letter. There was no television or radio back in the days of the covered wagons. People learned about what was going on in the world from reading newspapers, magazines, and letters. Before there were big cities in the West, all the newspapers and magazines came from the East. They had to be mailed out west, just like letters. By the time you got all the way to Oregon, it might take 2 years for a letter to get to you. And it could take just as long for a newspaper to get all the way out west. You might not know who was president of the United States until 2 years after the election. If you ran out of supplies, could you get more? Sometimes. Along the trail, there were a number of forts where the wagon trains would stop. You would usually stay over at a fort for a few days to rest up. It was also a chance to let the oxen, horses, and cows have a rest. After you left Independence, Missouri, the first big fort you reached was Fort Laramie. It took about 40 days to reach the fort. Most wagon trains got there at the end of June. There were lots of things to do when you got to Fort Laramie. It was a time to fix the wagons, do the laundry, and buy or trade for new supplies. Usually there were Indians at the fort. They set up their tents, which were called teepees, outside the walls of the fort, and traded with people at the fort. The pioneers wanted to buy sugar, flour, coffee, cloth, leather, and other things they had run out of. Sometimes the fort had extra supplies, but sometimes a wagon train had arrived before you and bought out just about everything. You would be out of luck then. It might take you almost 30 more days to get to the next fort, called Fort Bridger. This fort was named after a man called Jim Bridger, who was an early fur trader and trapper. He even helped guide some wagon trains west. Another fort you reached, Oregon. Another fort before you reached Oregon was Fort Hall. From there, you traveled west and north to Oregon. Some pioneers left the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall and went south and west to California instead. On either trip, you would still have to travel at least 2 more months. Was it hard driving the wagons over mountains? Yes. Some of the mountains were very high. You might have to borrow your neighbor's oxen to help pull your wagon up a high mountain. It would take a long time to get up the mountain this way. When you got to the top, the oxen had to be untied and sent down to help the next wagon. You also had to be very careful going down steep mountains. The pioneers put poles through the wheels to keep them from turning and rolling too fast. They would also tie one end of the rope to the back of the wagon and tie the other end around a tree or big rock at the top of the mountain. If you loosened the rope at the top very slowly, you could keep the wagon from racing down the hill. The heavier the wagons, the harder it was to cross the mountains. So often you would see chairs or tables or boxes that people had left behind on the trail to lighten their loads. Sometimes the pioneers even had to cut their wagons down so that they were left with a cart that only had 2 wheels. It was easier to take a 2-wheeled cart over some mountains than a whole wagon. You just hoped that wouldn't happen to your wagon.